We were extremely active in our efforts to achieve diplomatic recognition of the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam. But we also concentrated on supporting recognition of governments recently established through their own people's struggle for independence. In January 1972, the government of the Republic of Bangladesh was formed under the leadership of the great Bangladeshi patriot, Premier Mujibur Rahman. In January 1973, our provisional government announced its diplomatic recognition and established formal diplomat relations with the Republic of Bangladesh. Simultaneously, the government of Bangladesh also recognized and established relations with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and the Provisional Revolutionary Government. In June 1973, the Provisional Revolutionary Government of Vietnam opened an embassy in Dhaka. The people of Bangladesh were appreciative of our attitude. At Saigon's Tan Son Nyat Airport in an area called Camp David, the United Military Delegation of the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam under the command of Lieutenant General Tran Van Tra and, after him, under Major General Hoang An Tuan engaged vigorously with our opponents for 2 full years, until the day of Saigon's liberation. Our brothers and sisters in the United Military Delegation at Camp David struggled endlessly to oppose the Saigon authorities' military violations of the Paris Agreement. With equal or even greater difficulty, our comrades, among them my friend Ngoc Dung, by now an army major in order to carry out her tasks, also had to struggle to their wits' end to secure the release of our captured soldiers and 200,000 political prisoners. In July 1973, the president of our Government Advisory Council, Nguyen Hu Tho, participated in the Non-Aligned Movement's 4th Summit in Algiers. I joined the delegation along with several other ministers and deputy ministers. The summit formally accepted the PRG as an official member of the Non-Aligned Movement. Many leaders including Cuban President Fidel Castro, Algerian President Boumediene, Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, Cambodian King Norodom Sihanouk, 11, and other heads of state came to congratulate President Nguyen Hu Tho. Representatives from many other countries also expressed their pleasure in Vietnam's victory. They reiterated their demand that the Paris Agreement be strictly followed, and they affirmed their continued strong support for our struggle. After the Algiers conference, President Nguyen Hu Tho and I visited Senegal, Egypt, and Tanzania to thank our friends for their support during our struggle. President Tho received a sincere and warm welcome wherever he went. At that time, travel conditions for our delegation were particularly favorable because China had lent us a special airplane. During our visit to Tanzania, we experienced a minor but amusing faux pas. When we arrived at the airport, the Tanzanian military band had intended to welcome our delegation with our national anthem. However, by mistake, the band played Lu Hu Phuoc's Youth Military March, which had become the Saigon administration's national anthem. Our friends were mortified and apologetic. Tanzania and Vietnam were so far in physical distance from each other that our friends did not know which nation used which national anthem. The next day we visited Zanzibar, a small island off Tanzania. To rectify the earlier situation, our friends organized a military parade. The band played "Liberate South Vietnam" with great fanfare. In early 1974, a startling and major incident took place. On January 19, China sent warships and aircraft to occupy the Hoang Sa Paracel Islands, which lie within the sovereign territory of Vietnam and which at that time were under the jurisdiction of the Saigon administration. Fierce battles broke out. The forces were unequal, with the United States as a silent accomplice to the Chinese. In the end, the Chinese occupied the islands. On January 26, 1974, The PRG issued a 3-point statement, in which we affirmed Vietnam's national sovereignty over Hoang Sa, asserting that any maritime territorial disputes must be solved through negotiations. We reaffirmed our position on February 14. We agreed to discuss the issue with all concerned stakeholders. Here was the beginning of a complex dispute between China and Vietnam over sovereignty in the East Sea. The dispute continues even today. In June 1974, I received an invitation to attend the Afro-Asian Conference in Cairo. While en route, I stopped off in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, to lobby for official diplomatic recognition of the PRG. Today, the entire world knows about the tragedies that have occurred in Afghanistan during recent years, but by 1974 very few delegations from Vietnam had visited Kabul. Afghanistan, a country in Central Asia, is located between Russia, Pakistan, and Iran. It has vast mountains, with even the capital situated on hilltops. Afghanistan had just become a republic under President Muhammad Daoud. The Afghan Foreign Ministry gave me and my 2 PRG comrades a warm welcome. We were delighted to find that our Afghan friends had closely followed the situation in Vietnam. They knew we had signed the Paris Agreement the previous year. I explained our wish to establish diplomatic relations with Afghanistan. Our discussions revealed no difficulties, but our friends explained that the Afghan National Assembly had to affirm formal diplomatic recognition. They were sure the National Assembly would make an affirmative decision, but nevertheless this was a formality, which they could not overlook. I entreated, emphasizing that we needed positive and timely support. Our friends were sympathetic but unable to meet the delegation's request immediately. Nevertheless, I did leave with our friends, promise that they would work for an early decision. At the end of June 1974, the government of Afghanistan announced its official recognition of the PRG. Around September 1974, Defense Minister Tran Nam Trung and I were members of a PRG delegation, headed by PRG President of Government Nguyen Tan Phat, on a visit to the Kingdom of Cambodia. Our CP-72 division also sent comrades Trong Tung, a journalist, Luong Zon Tam, a documentary filmmaker, and Dr. Nung, who was responsible for our health. Even though traveling to the south was much easier than before because the United States was no longer bombing ceaselessly, the trip nevertheless took 12 days by military jeep. We drove at night and rested during the day. For me, traveling the famous Ho Chi Minh Trail was a historic and emotional event. I was so moved to see at the start of the trail a huge inscription, "Carve a route through the Trong Son mountain range to save our country." Indeed, building that system of tracks and roads had been a monumental achievement, requiring that engineers and laborers cut down mountains and fill in valleys. Only the extraordinary level of our people's patriotism could have achieved such a heroic feat. I have no idea how many forests, mountains, and streams we crossed during our 12 days and nights on the legendary trail. During that journey, I was most deeply impressed by the volunteer youth. Each unit had several hundred young women. After the terrible bombing attacks, these volunteer regiments repaired the dirt tracks, filled in the bomb craters, and removed bombing debris so that transport trucks and other military vehicles could keep moving. My heart went out to those roughly clad young women in their 20s. They chatted and laughed as they dug and hauled dirt, seemingly unaware of their great danger. Only later did I learn that most of these young women were middle-aged by the time they returned from the war. Many had no other skills to support themselves and were beyond marriageable age. Those brave, anonymous young women made an extraordinary contribution to our country. Their plight is still heart-rending. How many sacrifices like theirs went unnoticed during years of intense resistance and hardship? Indeed, until now, we have not fully recognized their contribution. We have left many of them deprived of deserved support and recognition. At times while on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, we would travel half a day without seeing anyone. We had 2 jeeps. Sometimes, the track was so rough we had to stop. I kept asking whether we lost our way. However, each day, we would eventually reach our destination, even on time. The comrades at each transit camp received us warmly. They would provide a drum of water for bathing and a meal of rice with meat from wild game and vegetables they had grown at the camp. At night, we would drink a cup of tonic made from Aliliacia, a kind of Vietnamese ginseng, mixed with sugar. Weary, we would quickly fall into a delicious sleep. One night we had to cross a river, but the enemy had destroyed the makeshift bridge, causing huge traffic jams on both banks. The Military Engineering Corps arrived. Some troops worked underwater, while others carried materials, all of them working without a pause. I felt overwhelmed with affection for these warriors. They were so young. Without war, they would surely have been students, workers, or farmers studying or working in their ancestral villages. Near Bu Dap, now a district adjacent to Loc Ninh, I met with a logistics unit at the front. I was amazed and delighted to see orchids blooming everywhere and to realize that, in the midst of such a fierce war, our soldiers took pleasure in growing flowers. Yet I will remember always that a number of the comrades I met at that time died the following year, during the spring 1975 campaign. The Kingdom of Cambodia was both a neighbor and a familial country. Our 2 peoples had cooperated in fighting French colonialism and then U.S. imperialism. Each nation had provided the other with valuable assistance and support. Even though Cambodia shares a border with Vietnam, the road leading to the offices of the Cambodian government was tortuous. That leg of the trip took a day and a night through deserted rubber forests. Eventually, we reached a post crowded with Cambodian guards and were taken to a spacious guest house made of wood. Before leaving for Cambodia, we knew that our signing the Paris Agreement on Vietnam had raised questions among our Cambodian friends, who worried that the agreement would work against the Cambodian struggle. Our mission's purpose was to clarify issues in the relationship between our 2 countries. During the Paris negotiations, the United States had wanted to combine Cambodian questions with Vietnamese issues, but Vietnam was resolute in refusing. We held firm to our position that the Cambodian people must decide any issues regarding Cambodia. Our delegation traveling to Cambodia wanted to state clearly that we felt the Paris Agreement created favorable conditions for Cambodia. In truth, Vietnam made concrete contributions to Cambodia's liberation, which occurred on April 17, 1975, even before the liberation of South Vietnam on April 30, 1975. As soon as we set foot in Cambodia, we sensed we were receiving a rather cool reception, which made us feel uneasy. Later, I learned that Cambodian leaders had already begun to adopt a position opposing Vietnam. The tragic events that ensued after 1975 made this all too clear. Already, we were experiencing disturbing symptoms in our own country's southwest flank. After spending a short time in the central office of the South, COSVN, in early 1975, I received urgent orders to return to the north for an overseas mission. This time, the journey back to the north was much quicker, although the Saigon administration's airplanes shot at us twice. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was much busier. Day and night, armored vehicles and trucks carrying ammunition poured down the trail. Waves of army units followed one another. Young soldiers from northern provinces marched to the battlefield as if in a procession. Preparations were underway for the 1975 Spring Campaign, the final battle of the American War, which by then had lasted 21 years, counting from the division of our country in 1954. The balance of forces on the battlefield rapidly tilted in our favor. On our side, the PRG stepped up its political forces inside the zones the Saigon administration temporarily occupied. We concentrated on the middle-class intelligentsia and religious groups and even included those close to the Saigon administration in order to expand our nationwide solidarity and divide our opponents. After the Paris Agreement, many Saigon politicians, including a number of retired ministers of state, used the name Third Force for zealous activities. By appropriating that term, they sought to insert themselves into the nonpartisan third group defined by the Paris Agreement and, thereby, undermine the clause, the United States must withdraw all troops and set up a Council of National Reconciliation and Concord with three components. The military and political situation in the country was tilting in our favor. Reactionaries in the United States faced the Saigon Army's consecutive defeats on various fronts. They advocated sending American troops back to Vietnam to rescue the Saigon administration. We had to denounce these deceitful intentions and the Saigon administration's concomitant refusal to implement the Paris Agreement. The United States continued providing assistance, thereby prolonging the war. For us, mobilizing world opinion was crucial. I left the South and traveled the trail back out to Hanoi in February 1975. I immediately received an assignment along with 3 other comrades to visit European and African countries and explain our views. At that time, we could not know for sure the Nixon administration's scheme. I knew only that, in accordance with our leaders' directive, I must update the loyal friends who had supported our struggle for so long. I needed to ask them to watch the situation carefully and speak out immediately if the Americans intervened. Through documents now open and particularly through Larry Berman's No Peace, No Honor, we know that the Nixon administration intended to deploy B-52 bombers against the North to rescue the Saigon Army, which was disintegrating. However, the Nixon administration did not carry out its plan. Instead, the Watergate scandal threw the White House into turmoil. Even more important, the majority of Americans expressed their opposition through the representatives they had elected to the U.S. Congress. Many senators insisted the United States abandon the failed war, which the entire world condemned and which had been so costly in human and material losses. I arrived in France, where I met with a number of journalists. While in France, I contacted friends in the United States, Canada, Sweden, and other countries. Then I went on to Algeria, where I met with friends, who were exuberant because our spring offensive had begun and our liberation army was advancing with irresistible, unconquerable force. Our friends said they had seen maps showing how our liberation army liberated a new province every day. Progress was so rapid our friends could not keep track. Our army launched the 1975 spring campaign by attacking Buon Ma Thuot. I knew the Politburo had set its goal of liberating South Vietnam within 2 years, 1975 and 1976. However, after the victory of Phuoc Long and particularly following the liberation of Buon Ma Thuot, the Politburo decided to seize its opportunity. In early 1975, the Politburo formally opened the general offensive to liberate the South. On the diplomatic front, the PRG continued achieving major victories. Other governments watching our army's massive victories saw that our struggle would soon end in victory. They quickly announced diplomatic recognition of the PRG. By the time the North and South were reunited in July 1976, 65 countries had recognized the Provisional Revolutionary Government. As a result of our visit to Algeria in early 1975, we knew the Summit for the Organization of African Unity, OUA, was about to begin in Tanzania. We flew there and asked our friends if I might speak to the assembly and inform the membership about an important situation. However, the OUA statutes allowed only representatives of African countries to speak. In addition, speakers could address only issues about Africa. I entreated our friends in Tanzania, the host country. In the end, the conference organizers agreed to give me 15 minutes at the end of the conference, once the members had completed their program. Lamai and I sat from 6 p.m. until 5 a.m. without eating or drinking, waiting to speak. When my turn came, my throat felt dry. I worried I could not utter a word. But we achieved our goal. We described the situation developing in Vietnam and called on the international community to prevent the United States from sending troops back to Vietnam. On April 15, Hanoi cabled us to return immediately. We had no money to buy air tickets, and Tanzania did not have a Vietnamese embassy. We decided to ask for help from the Chinese embassy, which provided assistance at once. By the time I returned to Hanoi, we had liberated Da Nang. Our armed forces were advancing toward Saigon. I received orders to go to Da Nang, where Government Council President Nguyen Hu Tho and many other PRG officials had already gathered. During that period, the PRG issued important statements and received foreign delegations as well as journalists. Since our troops had just liberated Da Nang, people from Quang Tri, Thua Thien, and Quang Ngai provinces were converging on the city, but we established order within only a few days. Our new administrative system began to take effect. On the evening of April 29, 1975, I was hosting American historians Gabriel and Joyce Kolko when we heard Liberation Radio broadcast an appeal to the Saigon administration and the Saigon military to surrender. This deeply stirring news moved the American historians and me to tears. We held hands. The next day, on April 30, what had to happen did finally, at long last, happen. Saigon was liberated. This news brought boundless joy. Radio stations and other international media announced this news. Saigon has collapsed. The Viet Cong are victorious. People across our country poured into the streets, embracing one another and weeping but with tears of joy. The common endeavor and sacrifice of all our people had brought about the inevitable. So many people working overtly and covertly had contributed from the armed forces to political forces. From the children who had directed us along local paths to our compatriots from all strata of society. From the heroes whose names are known, to the millions upon millions of heroes whose names we do not know. No one can say, your contribution was this, mine was that. At that moment, I thought of our large rear area in the socialist north. This was our rearguard but also our vanguard. I remembered once when I had visited Palestinian friends in refugee camps and when I met the Palestinian leader, Yasser Arafat. Everyone asked us where and how Vietnam had drawn its strength for struggle and victory. We answered, there are three factors. We have Ho Chi Minh, an outstanding Vietnamese leader, who gave his entire life in service to our struggle for independence and freedom. We have our people's intense, strong solidarity. And we have the North, the socialist half of our country as our huge, stable rearguard. Our Palestinian friends compared our situation with theirs and saw that, unfortunately, they did not have our strong points. Vietnam's final victory, which had been achieved in the end with such speed, astounded and elated the world. As I understood the situation, even the Soviet Union and China, two of Vietnam's staunchest friends, were somewhat taken aback. China had persistently advised us to prolong guerrilla ambush attacks because the enemy was too powerful. The Soviet Union worried we were not strong enough to win and feared the war would spread, complicating the world situation. The Vietnamese people's tenacity and heroism and our final victory enhanced the position of the socialist camp in the international arena. We were also proud that we had boosted the confidence and determination of people in other countries fighting against imperialism, particularly against U.S. imperialism, and struggling for peace, independence, and social progress. We can never forget that behind Vietnam's great victory stood the immense, invaluable, and essential contribution of the people in socialist countries as well as the world's people who esteem peace and justice. Since we had been able to begin and conduct the war courageously and cleverly, we knew we could also conclude it properly. 8. Memories and deeply held thoughts. For 14 years, 1962 to 1976, I was active in foreign relations for the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, NLF, Provisional Revolutionary Government, PRG. As I look across my life, those years comprise the period most worthy of note, for they cover some of our country's major events, which I witnessed and in which I had the very good fortune to participate. I will always hold dear the deep impressions and many priceless lessons from that time. I can say that our leaders gave deep thought to Vietnam's political policies and provided careful direction during the Paris Conference in particular and during our struggle in general. First, I want to mention the guideline to establish the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam on December 20, 1960. This wise policy was both strategic and tactical. Through that step, we created a united national front involving all social strata. We included not only the patriotic forces of the NLF with lawyer Nguyen Hu Tho, a major Southern intellectual, as president but also the National Alliance for Democracy and Peace led by lawyer Trinh Dinh Thao, another famous Southern intellectual, as well as two large groups. The people who really were the third force, and the patriotic overseas Vietnamese. In addition to that guideline, we took advantage of the prestige of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRVN, the Socialist, North, and, in particular, the great prestige and respect accorded to the DRVN leader, President Ho Chi Minh. This allowed us to leverage widespread support and solidarity with worldwide forces working for peace, independence, freedom, and justice. We can say that voices from everywhere from large cities to remote villages, including even those close to the North Pole, announced solidarity with Vietnam. Everyone agrees today that the international solidarity movement with Vietnam, which formed in opposition to the American War of Aggression, was the largest and longest such movement in world history. That worldwide movement of people who cherish peace was extremely important in contributing to Vietnam's eventual victory. To understand the NLF's value and significance, we must look at the circumstances that led to its establishment. The period from 1956 until 1959 was a terribly bleak time in the South. The U.S. Diem regime instituted merciless repression of the Southern Peace Movement, which was demanding implementation of the 1954 Geneva Agreement. Then the U.S. Diem regime organized a campaign to denounce and eradicate communists, including everyone from the old resistance movement against France, as well as anyone who opposed the Saigon regime. To do this, the regime's police hauled guillotines into villages throughout the South. Prisons sprouted up everywhere. They were brimming with people, old and young, men and women. Tens of thousands of people in the countryside were held in colossal camps called strategic hamlets. Many international journalists concluded, the South is one giant prison. For a long time, activists in the South followed the party's directive to resist through peaceful demonstrations and reconciliation, but the enemy pushed us to the end of our patience. Armed to the teeth, the enemy terrorized and executed our people en masse, yet we had only our empty hands. We could not stand silently with our arms folded while the enemy waged its one-sided war. Our people asked to take up arms. The party heard our people's mournful pleas and, just in time, changed the guidelines for our resistance movement. In 1959, the party implemented its historic Decision 15, which accelerated the political struggle and simultaneously expedited military action. thereby opening the route through which the people of the South could achieve victory. Decision 15 was a turning point in our nation's modern history and particularly in our struggle against the United States. Like a flood breaking a dike, our people in many localities responded to the party's new guidelines with uprisings. In the midst of this ebullience, the party guided the formation of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam to unite the various strata of Southerners in struggle against the United States. The goal was our country's independence and reunification. In this special context, the NLF served not only as a political organization uniting all people in political and armed struggle but also as a de facto political administration. From 1960 until 1969, the Front established committees at various levels to lead our people in political, military, economic, cultural, and diplomatic affairs. Another political victory worthy of note is the formation of the Alliance of National, Democratic, and Peace Forces of Vietnam with lawyer Trinh Dinh Thao, a great intellectual in the South, as president. The alliance, which was established on April 20, 1968, a few months after the Tet 1968 offensive, included many patriots, intellectuals, and religious leaders, whose views were patriotic and whose members were organizing more openly in the cities. With this step, our front opposing the United States to save the nation expanded. When describing the Vietnamese struggle, especially during the resistance against France and the resistance against the United States, we should remember that most of the major Vietnamese intellectuals participated alongside the farmers and the workers. Similarly, when describing the international movement united with Vietnam, we should remember that many key intellectuals in other nations were also active participants. Everyone who was of sufficient age at that time remembers the Bertrand Russell Tribunal established by Bertrand Russell, the famous British philosopher-mathematician. Participants included other famous intellectuals, such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Laurent Schwartz. We know that, most of all, intellectuals understand the value of the individual, and they understand the meaning of freedom and justice. The 1968 Tet General Offensive burst forth 8 years after the Front's founding and reverberated across the South. This event was a core victory and another key turning point in the Vietnamese people's Revolutionary War. 11 years later, in September 1979, the Fourth Congress of the Communist Party affirmed, "Only with the spring of 1968 could we have had the spring of 1975." Up until now, a number of authors who were American officials, particularly in the military, have held that the Viet Cong suffered a heavy defeat during the Tet Offensive of 1968, the year of the monkey. They have also believed that, had the Americans plunged headlong by using their full military strength, the United States probably would have achieved victory. These are the shallow and blind views of those who saw apparent facts but not the essence of the issue. They saw the temporal unfold before their eyes, but they did not see the whole. Therefore, they could neither perceive nor foresee the underlying, inevitable, and ultimate conclusion. Our losses during the Tet General Offensive were certainly not small, but that heroic offensive did shake the aggressive will of the United States. Previously, our Liberation Army had achieved only small victories in rural areas. However, with the Tet Offensive, our troops struck in unison across the South and achieved victories inside the capital and at the enemy's headquarters. The meaning was clear. In no place could the enemy be secure. The 1968 Tet Offensive forced the United States to reach a very important decision: the need to search for a way to de-escalate the war. It compelled the Johnson administration to enter into negotiations, even though the United States held tenaciously to the goal of finding a solution from a position of strength. For years, we in the South had been struggling against U.S. escalation of the war. On June 26, 1954, 3 weeks before the signing of the Geneva Agreement, the United States brought Ngo Dinh Diem from New York to Saigon to serve as Prime Minister of the Republic of Vietnam. Ngo Dinh Diem had spent the previous 3 years outside New York City in a Catholic seminary. On January 20, 1960, President Kennedy decided to use Vietnam as a site for special war. On May 11, 1961, the United States sent to Vietnam 400 Special Forces soldiers and 100 advisors to set up strategic hamlets, which incarcerated millions of Vietnamese. Then, in December, the number of advisors increased to 3,200. Yet the special war failed. In August 1964, the Johnson administration staged the Tonkin Gulf Incident in order to expand the war. On March 8, 1965, 2,500 U.S. Marines landed at Da Nang and Chu Lai, beginning the localized war. On July 30, 1965, the United States sent masses of troops to increase its forces for localized war. By the end of 1967, the number of U.S. and Allied troops, excluding the Saigon Army, ARVN, had reached 600,000. Indeed, by the time the Paris Conference began in 1968, we in the South were facing an occupying U.S. Army. Our guideline for the four-party conference in Paris was to fight through negotiations, thereby opening the struggle's new diplomatic front to increase our strength in battle. This policy was both correct and wise. During the 5 years of the four-party conference, we in the South increased our military strength through assistance from the North. We on the political and diplomatic fronts took advantage of widespread international world opinion to weaken the enemy's rearguard. We can view the Paris negotiating table as a new, effective battlefield with continuing offensives first from the NLF and then from the PRG, beginning with the 10 points, then the 8 points, then the 7 points, and finally the 2 points. These successive proposals increasingly cornered the enemy. In particular, we can view the 7-point plan, which we presented in July 1971, as our diplomatic equivalent to the .1968 Tet Offensive. We concentrated on our demand that the United States remove all its military forces from South Vietnam. We set aside our desire for an immediate political solution in the South. This final blow forced the United States to follow the direction of eventually accepting the draft Paris Agreement, which Vietnam had presented. After the signing of the Paris Agreement in late January 1973, our leaders predicted that 2 outcomes were possible in early 1973. In the first case, the Saigon administration would continue the war with U.S. support and assistance. In the second case, the situation between the Saigon administration and the PRG with the Third Force would become very complicated and turn into a morass, but in the end we would surely achieve victory. Not long after the actual signing, we saw that the first possibility was more likely and that the balance of forces increasingly favored us. In 1975, the party decided that we must strike quickly, defeat the puppet troops, and liberate the South. This was a correct and timely policy. Thus, our troops and supportive civilians launched the 1975 Spring General Offensive, bringing total victory. We can draw important lessons from our resistance war against the United States and from our struggle to assure the nation's independence and sovereignty. I think particularly about these major strategic guidelines. We knew how to coordinate our national strength, using the power of timing. With that overall guideline, we relied on political advantages and resources from the Soviet Union, China, and the Socialist bloc at the same time that we took advantage of worldwide sympathy and the call for justice. The result was multiplied strength. Here, I feel I must record accurately the NLF's important contribution through its flexible policy combined with wise, dynamic action. Using this approach, we elicited sympathy and won over people with differing political views, thereby creating a strong, widespread, international movement of support. In addition, we always followed our own principles of independence and self-reliance on the battlefield and in the negotiations. We took advantage of our friends' advice, yet we always made our own decisions to ensure our own national interest. We had a great need in the southern battlefield for weapons during this cruel stage of the war, yet the transport distance from the north along the Ho Chi Minh Trail to the south was long and fraught with difficulties. Some countries allied with us suggested they send personnel to drive vehicles and weapons to the south. Our Vietnamese leaders expressed their thanks but refused these offers. We asked to receive the weapons, but the transport and use of those weapons was our work and our responsibility. We refused to allow the war to spread into an international conflict, for this would have been complicated and would have caused us to lose the initiative. Equally, we refused to allow the ongoing division of our country. The 1954 Geneva Conference had brought us many valuable insights. We were determined to fight, and we knew how to fight. We knew how to begin a war, and we knew how to conclude a war. Now, after nearly 40 years, many political activists across the world still claim to have been completely surprised at the victory of the people of Vietnam, such a small country, which dared to fight against the world's largest imperialist power. To understand the sources of this heroic outcome, we must remember Vietnam's recorded history of 2,000 years, during which our ancestors established and defended our nation. It is imperative to research the materials, signed documents, and summaries, probably incomplete, of the comrades who were the historical participants. Many other comrades and I usually make this additional point. President Ho Chi Minh was the father and soul of our country and of our people's formidable resistance war against the United States. The party's directives followed Ho Chi Minh's substantive ideology regarding domestic and international unity. Alongside President Ho, the Politburo led by Comrade Le Duan was the supreme political command as well as the general tactical headquarters for steering the country during the war's dangerous and decisive stages. I remember 1956 and 1957, when the enemy launched its White Terror in the South. Many people were very worried and did not understand what might come with future struggle in the South. At that time, Comrade Le Duan declared, "It's not that the enemy is strong. Instead, the enemy is weakening. He must resort to savage means in order to crush the masses." Reality has decisively proven this lucid, sharp-witted point, for the enemy's savage, White Terror increased the Southerners' anger and desire for action. Based on this understanding and the design for the Southern Revolution, in 1959, the party instituted its historic Decision 15. The letter Comrade Le Duan sent to Comrade Pham Hung in 1975 regarding the major points of a Politburo meeting allows us to understand more clearly the Politburo's purpose, intelligence, skill, and spirit in guiding the conclusion of the war, which had lasted nearly 30 years when counting from 1945. During these last decisive moments, Comrade Le Duan's directive was perceptive and precise. This is the most favorable opportunity. No other opportunity will be comparable. If we wait another 10 or 15 years, the situation will become complicated, endlessly complicated. We must work fast, completely, and thoroughly but wisely and skillfully. I think we should continue to remember the huge contribution of Comrade Le Duan. However, to cover the whole effort requires speaking of all the contributions from all the leaders of the Workers' Party, now the Vietnamese Communist Party, for they were very close to our people. Today, the international communist movement is in a period of setbacks. However, we Vietnamese certainly could not have liberated our country without the sound and skilled leadership of the party. Even though the contributions of senior party leaders were significant, it is essential to remember the millions of party members and the brave masses of people who followed the party and protected the party. They fought with all their strength and courage, and they were indomitable. Tens of thousands, even millions of people from one generation to the next, lost their lives for our nation's sacred cause while fighting under the party's flag. During the War of Resistance against the United States, I was assigned to work in foreign relations. In addition to taking part in the Paris Conference, my other primary work was mobilizing international support for our resistance movement. Perhaps I can say that the chance to meet people everywhere helped me gain important understandings. We have often spoken of the great support we received from people in countries across the world. To be fair, I must also speak about the important role of governments. Many Western countries had special interest relationships and could not support us. Some even followed the United States in opposing Vietnam. At the same time, other countries, especially Sweden, were completely different. Those countries, from their people to their governments, became close and tireless friends of Vietnam. From the beginning, the Swedish government publicized and opposed the U.S. policy of aggression against Vietnam and was faithful to the end. We often speak about the Swedish people, the major political and cultural Swedish leaders, and the details of their closeness to Vietnam. In Sweden, people say there was the Vietnam generation, and that Vietnam entered their lives. Large numbers of Swedish youth as well as youth in many other countries became political converts to our people's struggle. Vietnam brought them a fresh reason to live. I think the strength of what is right and just per se conquered their hearts. Sweden, like other countries of Northern Europe, is a cousin of the United States, but the Swedes could not accept the Americans' cruel actions. Many Americans who refused to fight left the United States and received asylum in Sweden. The Bertrand Russell Tribunal and many other international meetings in support of Vietnam occurred there. The Swedes were empathetic, and their voluntary actions were evidence of a truly civilized country with a deep tradition of compassion. Yet, in addition to the pacific attitudes of the Swedish public, we must also speak of the role and actions of the Swedish government and of the nation's leaders, in particular Premier Olof Palme. I wanted to speak clearly about this because many people in our country do not yet know about the tremendously helpful role Sweden played during our time of need. I had occasion to visit nearly all the socialist countries, from the Soviet Union and China to the countries of Eastern Europe and Cuba. These days, the socialist bloc no longer remains, the Soviet Union has disbanded, and many other countries have changed their orientation or have become more complicated. However, we must nevertheless say that the support and closeness of the governments in the socialist countries during our resistance war against the United States were hugely significant. In particular, the Soviet Union and China were the stable support for the Vietnamese front lines. Of course, varieties of national interest motivated each of the countries that offered assistance. Nevertheless, their support was extremely important. We all know Soviet and Chinese aid came in stages, and we know there were serious conflicts between the two nations. However, Uncle Ho and the party offered sincerity, seriousness, care, and perhaps we can even say great skill to find a clear, flexible path to secure support from these important, older sibling countries and from other socialist nations as well. Political activists from other countries have described this as implementation of traditional Vietnamese political wisdom. While I was traveling overseas as a representative for the NFL, I had an opportunity to attend an international conference in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea. Here was an unusual nation, where the people venerated their leader and where the leader's words were orders for the populace. North Korea shared with us the plight of a nation divided because of an earlier American-led war. As such, North Korea was a dedicated supporter of Vietnam's struggle to oppose the United States and one of the first countries to recognize the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam. Several comrades in our delegation and I went to Hungary many times to work or to rest at Balaton Lake, a famous resort. Everyone we met in Hungary, from the senior-level leaders to ordinary people, supported Vietnam, but particularly Foreign Minister Janos Peter. He would say to me, "Whatever you Vietnamese friends need, we're ready to help." In addition, many Vietnamese comrades and I went to visit the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. At that time, Germany was divided into two countries. Comrades in East Germany, from the party leaders and the government to the mass organizations, all felt strong connections to Vietnam and were zealously supportive in spirit and through shipments of material goods. Many Vietnamese cadres, including those wounded on the battlefield in the south, were brought first to the north and then traveled to East Germany for medical treatment by excellent doctors. At that time, the authorities in West Germany did not support our people's struggle. Nevertheless, the solidarity movement with Vietnam in West Germany was dynamic. Weber, a textile engineer, organized aid to Vietnam. Through her efforts, many patriotic intellectuals and important social activists in West Germany came to understand the Vietnamese people's struggle. They helped us with medical equipment and medicines. This assistance continued after the liberation of the South. Weber's empathy with Vietnam was very deep. In her last will and testament, she stated her wish that Vietnam be her permanent resting place, for that was where her heart had been. This gesture moved us deeply. We implemented her wish. The Paris Conference gave me the opportunity to live in France for many years and observe French society. I met many French intellectuals, communist laborers, and progressives. They were upstanding, straightforward, and ready to support people facing difficulties and oppression, even though their own lives were not always easy. I came to understand more about French history and the glorious French cultural heritage of such great thinkers and writers as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Victor Hugo, and others. In addition, we were near the heart of the 1789 democratic proletarian revolution, the Paris Commune, and the motto, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. Indeed, the French people have a democratic tradition. I witnessed many demonstrations as well as workers' and students' strikes. I also came to understand in part capitalist, consumer society. If a person had a job, he could borrow money from a bank to buy a house and pay off the loan every month at ordinary interest rates. However, if he lost his job and had no money to pay the bank, then the bank would take back the house and he would be out on the street. During the negotiations in France, the DRVN and NLFPRG delegations received wholehearted assistance from the French Communist Party and the overseas Vietnamese community. We will always remember the images of our French security guards and drivers, whom the French Communist Party assigned to help us. They worked with complete dedication for years. So many Vietnamese living in France set aside their own work to come to our houses to make repairs and assist our delegations whenever we had a need. We had special friends and comrades, who were very close to us. They stood alongside us throughout the long march of 2 wars of resistance, first against France and then against the United States. Even now, they stand with us in our struggle to build and develop our country. Our people will always remember Henri Martin and Raymond Dean, the husband and wife who opposed French colonialism's re-invasion of Vietnam and were imprisoned and suffered many other losses. Another especially close friend is Madeleine Riffaut, a hero during the French resistance against the German Nazis. She supported Vietnam's struggle to secure independence. We know she sacrificed her individual happiness to help our struggle. These days, although she is elderly, frail, and blind, she still follows the situation in Vietnam. Her meetings with Vietnamese friends, including Binh, are her happiest moments. She will talk continuously for hours, forgetting illness and pain. Many overseas Vietnamese intellectuals in France made huge contributions to our two delegations in Paris. These include Nguyen Trung Dong, Lam Ba Chao, Pham Ngoc Toi, and Dr. Therese Phan. The list goes on. After liberation, Nguyen Vinh Mai returned to Vietnam and served as Chief Justice in the Ho Chi Minh City Court. Dr. Nguyen Ngoc Ha and Professor Nguyen Ngoc Tran also returned home and participated in the National Assembly. And there were others. Some had to remain in France because of family circumstances. These include Brother Tran Hu Niep, who made many personal sacrifices for our shared work. I also had the chance to visit many Asian countries in addition to socialist China. India made a deep impression on me. Ho Chi Minh and Vietnam enjoyed considerable prestige in India, particularly in Calcutta, Kolkata and Bengal, where the Communist Party was influential. Indians felt a special empathy with the Vietnamese struggle. However, while there, I witnessed the stark separation between rich and poor. A provincial governor would have a beautiful palace surrounded by a park with prancing deer. But not far away were people who were desperately poor and living on the streets. I wondered, why do they have this situation? Is it the drawn-out legacy of the caste system? Is it religion? Political trends? Negative consequences from nearly a century of British domination? India has an ancient and glorious culture. Today, Indians rank among the world's greatest experts in many fields. It's unusual, but they have two communist parties. It seems to me that if the Indians unify their people even more strongly and take full advantage of the potential of their citizenry and their natural resources, they will create a major political and economic power. During the war, people from the NLF could not secure visas to Japan. At that time, the Japanese government stood alongside the United States, which had many military bases in Japan. The largest of these was Okinawa, from which U.S. airplanes left every day to bomb Vietnam. However, we knew that Japan had a citizens' movement in strong support of our struggle. The progressive forces in Japan included organizations of youth, women, workers, the Peace Committee, the Vietnamese-Japanese Friendship Committee, the Bihurin Organization, Citizens' League for Peace in Vietnam, and representatives of the Japanese Communist Party. They organized many activities to oppose the U.S. war of aggression. Thousands of people held sit-ins at Japanese ports to prevent the United States from sending war materiel to Vietnam. They organized a movement, a yen for Vietnamese women and children. The Japanese had been victims of the 2 U.S. nuclear bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These friends could easily feel sympathy with the people of Vietnam. Many countries in Africa and Latin America viewed Vietnam as a model. Their government's support and help was great, with results in many areas. By the time we liberated the South on April 30, 1975, the PRG had received official diplomatic recognition from 65 countries, with the number of African countries second to the number of socialist countries. I visited many countries in Africa, that huge continent. We know that Africa was the cradle of human beings, yet the level of economic development and living standards remains young. In comparison with other continents, the thirst of each person everywhere is the same. And so, whether Africans at that time knew a little or a lot about politics, they sympathized with the struggle of Vietnamese, who had been oppressed and exploited like them. I took part in many international gatherings, from international solidarity conferences to governmental meetings. Vietnam's position received a consistently warm response from many African governments, particularly Algeria, Guinea, Mali, Madagascar, and Tanzania. Throughout his life, Algerian President Houari Boumediene and Foreign Minister Abdelaziz Bouteflika, currently the President of Algeria, strongly supported the Vietnamese struggle and regarded it as their own people's struggle. President Boumediene paid close attention to my travels to build international relations. Once, he said to me, "I invite you to travel free of charge whenever you are on a mission to a country covered by our airline." Even now, and even though our two countries have developed differently, Algerians speaking of Vietnam will place their hands over their hearts and say, "Ho Chi Minh, Dien Bien Phu, Vo Nguyen Giap." Our African friends, empathy and admiration for Vietnam remain. After we achieved independence, many African nations also developed along the lines of socialism, but most of those nations lost direction after the socialist bloc disintegrated. Many currently face difficulties, including increased divisions among religious, racial, and ethnic groups. They look toward Vietnam in hopes of drawing from our experience. As for the Americas, at that time, I was able to visit only Cuba. Comrade Fidel Castro and the Cuban people left a deep impression on me. Melba Hernandez, president of the Committee for Solidarity with Vietnam, retained a special feeling for Vietnamese and was a particularly close Cuban sister. Several thousand Cuban youths volunteered to join the struggle in Vietnam. Our Cuban friends showed their deepest feelings when encouraging the Vietnamese people during our cruel resistance war. In speaking of Cuba, we always remember the revolutionary, Che Guevara. I had occasion to read a number of the letters that Che Guevara had sent to Fidel Castro and to friends in Bolivia. It is rare to find such ardent revolutionary feelings and thoughts. Those revolutionaries' greatest happiness was to serve the cause of justice. This point explains why the revolutionary warriors in Latin America and even as far away as Venezuela were so moved by Vietnamese hero Nguyen Van Troy. Guerrillas in Venezuela captured an American officer and offered to exchange the officer for Nguyen Van Troy. Even though their initiative failed, we prized the effort of these friends far away in South America. Only recently have we learned details of that story. Early in August 1964, Commander Luis Correa of the Unidades Tácticas de Combate, UTC, a leftist tactical combat unit, announced that in Vietnam an electrician named Nguyen Van Troy had attempted to assassinate U.S. Secretary of Defense McNamara. Luis Correa reported that the attempt had failed, Troy had been arrested, and the Saigon administration would execute Troy. Mr. Correa assigned a UTC action unit with 12 members to capture an American, whom the UTC would exchange for Troy. The 12-man unit divided into 4 subgroups, with each assigned to one of 4 tasks. Capture the American, transport him, guard him, and negotiate. The subgroup that captured U.S. Air Force Colonel Michael Smolin included 5 men. Noel Quintero, leader, Carlos Rey, David Salazar, Raul Rodriguez, and Carlos Urgenis Martinez. The attempted exchange of the American prisoner to rescue Nguyen Van Troy failed. Nevertheless, we so value the feelings of these friends from South America, who joined us in the struggle. In Chile, on November 4, 1970, the Marxists achieved victory in the elections. Salvador Allende came to power. Although his cause was short-lived, he was assassinated by Pinochet. His government expanded the revolution and, in particular, made clear its support for the Vietnamese people's struggle. Shortly after Allende took office, he announced on March 25, 1971 the establishment of diplomatic relations with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam. President Allende even covered the expenses for the 2 Vietnamese offices. From the beginning of the 20th century, a leftist movement began to flourish in Latin America, the backyard of American imperialism. Today, these countries understand U.S. neo-colonialism and search for ways to benefit their own people and create worldwide peace and justice. Of course, I could not visit the United States during the war years, but I did meet Americans at gatherings organized by U.S. groups opposed to the war. Many U.S. delegations came to Paris to visit us, including congressional representatives, families of American prisoners, women, and youth opposed to the war. They made a beautiful impression on us, particularly the American women, who wanted the war to end and to have peace so their husbands and sons could avoid the draft and an early death. They were filled with sorrow and embarrassment after they learned that their husbands and sons had perpetrated extreme acts of cruelty on the Vietnamese people. In 1971, Women's Strike for Peace organized a meeting in Canada, where American women met with women from the 3 countries of Indochina. Some of the U.S. women announced, the Vietnamese women, are not the enemy. They are our sisters. There were many demonstrations, often with women as the majority of the participants. A photograph from a demonstration in Miami, Florida in 1972 contains a detail particularly moving to me. One of the sisters is wearing a T-shirt with an image of me. Binh and the slogan, "Live like her." They recently learned that many women wore me Binh T-shirts at demonstrations across the United States. Those American women were supporting a Viet Cong woman leader, yet at that same time, in South Vietnam, American soldiers were being ordered to kill any Viet Cong. They saw. Those American women were truly courageous. Many Americans from different strata of society ardently opposed the U.S. war and supported Vietnam. I want our people always to remember the names of 10 Americans, among them 5 youth, who immolated themselves to give voice to the American people's choking anger about the meaningless American war in Vietnam. They were peace warriors and war martyrs. Just as President Ho Chi Minh said. In speaking about the Friends in the U.S. anti-war movement, Dave Dellinger is the person I want to emphasize the most. I could say he was the president of the American peace movement demanding an end to the war in Vietnam. He was one of the first Americans to visit North Vietnam and also someone who held firmly to his positions on peace and justice. Tom Hayden, an anti-war movement leader, loved Jane Fonda. Their sense of purpose was the struggle to demand an end to the American war in Vietnam. They named their son Troy in memory of Nguyen Van Troy. Cora Weiss is a famous and tireless woman activist. Many women in the peace movement, such as Carol Brightman, named their children Ben Peace, out of their love for Vietnam. By now, there may be a dozen American women named Ben. And, of course, it is impossible to forget the great humanitarians, Dr. Benjamin Spock and Jane Cheney Spock. I have an adopted son, Rennie Davis, an American youth who used all his strength in the movement to support Vietnam. Davis was a very sensitive young man, who worked tirelessly in the U.S. anti-war movement. At the end of 1969, Davis came to Paris, where we met and where he asked me to accept him as an adopted son, although mother and son had not yet had the occasion to know each other well. The following year, Davis met me again and asked why, after so lengthy a struggle, the war had not ended. I explained and encouraged Davis to believe in our ultimate victory, but perhaps I was unable to persuade him. After that, I never met Davis again, but I heard from a number of American friends that he had moved to India and entered a monastery. In fact, that wasn't the truth at all. In 2013, Rennie Davis and his wife were on the list of Americans visiting Vietnam to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the signing of the Paris Agreement. I was so delighted to meet Davis again. He had not entered a monastery in India as rumors had led me to believe but, instead, had continued his activism in the United States. Only during this recent meeting did I come to understand more fully his anti-war accomplishments. This increased my affection for him. Rennie was among the Chicago Seven, and had been selected by the New York Times as one of the most important political figures in U.S. history. He had organized large anti-war demonstrations, including the one at the Democratic Party's National Convention in 1968. These days, Rennie works in technology and leadership training. Rennie has an idea to assist Vietnam with many projects. In particular, he wants to help produce inexpensive computer hardware of high quality because he knows Vietnam still has many challenges. The sentiments of my close American friends remain deep. Some people are especially precious to me. Even now, they remain faithful to the cause of Vietnam's struggle. I think, for example, of Merle Ratner, older sister, Mo, the wife of Professor Ngo Thanh Nguyen.